If you've been wanting to get into photo scanning but you weren't sure where to start, then you will love this interview. G'day and welcome to the Andrew Price Podcast, the podcast for serious artists. In this interview, you're going to be hearing from Menzies, who I can't think of anyone more knowledgeable on the topic of photo scanning because I work with him here at Poliigon. I've been working with him for the last 8 years. He is the Photoscanning Manager at Poliigon and has basically figured out how to scan pretty much everything. We talk about some of that in this. What are the challenges of photo scanning? What objects can you scan? What can't you scan? And then what are the biggest mistakes that a lot of beginners make when they get into the hobby? What's important to get right? What gear does he recommend? What software does he recommend? That's all in here. So this is a great one to start on if you're looking to get into it or you want to get really serious about creating production-ready, high-quality assets with your camera. So yeah, let's get into it. Mason, thanks for joining us.
No doubt. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah. Why don't you, let's start, actually, because photoscanning has been around a lot longer than people think.
For sure, yeah.
When did it was like the 90s? Was like the first photogrammetry test?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, probably.
What is it good at and what is it bad at? Let's start there.
Oh boy, that's a packed question. You know, I never say that photogrammetry is bad at something.
Okay.
It's just a question of whether or not it's the best, right? But for most things, when it comes to capturing a subject, photogrammetry is going to do the trick. There's a lot of things, obviously, that you can get into that are reflective or translucent. Those cause a lot of problems. But as a general tool of acquisition, and you're not hand modeling something, photogrammetry hits all the marks, right? It's really fantastic at nature, and that's kind of what it's built for, I think. Doing something, you know, where you need assets for an environment, photogrammetry is always going to be your go-to because it's really unbeaten when it comes to details and capturing the nuance in a subject that, as a hand modeler or a texture, you'll almost never think of. Like, you can study something for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, and you're never going to be able to get to the fidelity that you get out of a scan, right? And when it comes to nature, that's really where photogrammetry shines. But I think if you expand outside of that, the usefulness of photogrammetry starts to dwindle a little bit. So things that are, you know, very smooth, very pristine, things that don't have a lot of grit or dirt or grunge to them, something, pristine. It starts to be like, okay, I could certainly do this with photogrammetry, and I want to do this with photogrammetry, but the question comes down to, should I do it with photogrammetry? And a lot of the time, it's not the case. There's plenty of times where doing something without photogrammetry is far, far better, right? And then you can even look at other methods of scanning, right? Photogrammetry is one form of 3D scanning, and there's loads of other types of 3D scanning out there. But then sometimes it's better to just do... Oh, yeah? Oh, yeah, sorry to cut you off. I was going to say, so as an example, like something pristine, like maybe like a ceramic white vase or something. Right? For sure.
Why would that be hard to scan?
Well, photogrammetry is based off of searching for features. When I try to explain photogrammetry to somebody new, I try to relate it to something they might be familiar with, especially in, you know, games or VFX industry. And one thing that's interesting to look at is automated camera tracking. Automated camera tracking, when you're trying to track the motion of a camera, you can do it based off of high points of interest in your footage, right? And photogrammetry, from like its kind of core structure, works very similarly. You'll have a lot of photos, you know, depending on how large your data set is, but you'll have a lot of photos that you're working with, and it's going to try and search through those photos to find things that are of interest, high contrast points, things that really jump out immediately, something that it can track, right? Okay, this looks like something I can track. It's going to look for that in many photos. So kind of how it works is it's going to find that in one photo, and then in the next photo, it's going to look for it again. And it's finding hundreds and thousands of these points, right? As many as it possibly can. And then it's going to compare those between each photo so that it can make measurements based off of those points. If you're working with something that's quite pristine, like a white ceramic vase or bowl or something, you can imagine there's not a lot of points of interest on that, right? So if you're looking at something like a rock, far more detailed, far more gritty. There's a lot for it to pick from, a lot for it to search for, but something that's pristine, far less what we call key points or tie points. They're very, very consistently colored throughout, right? Something that's pristine is a lot harder in that regard.
Interesting. Okay. Could it get confused if it was like repetitive points? Like, I don't know, like a
Yes.
polka dot vase?
For sure. Yeah. No,
Okay.
it definitely can. Something that I found interesting, at Poliigon, we were looking into doing a lot of wood and wood flooring. And just as an experiment, when I built out one of the rigs that we use at Poliigon, I tested it out on my floor. But my floor is vinyl. It's not an actual hardwood floor. It's laminate flooring. So essentially it's just a fake piece of wood with a picture of wood on top. But what I didn't realize
Right, like
is
printed on top, yeah.
Exactly. What I didn't realize is like that pattern repeats. There's floorboards in my floor that are the same, right? They in multiple
Right.
places. So I go to scan it and it's aligning those floorboards on top of each other, even though they're completely separated. So that can come up a lot of the time, not just with things that are man-made like that are, repetitive in that regard, but even things that you don't necessarily think is repetitive. It all depends on how close you're getting to something. So even something that's like a polka dot vase, yeah, if it's solid, like it's either a polka dot that's solid or it's the white background, that's probably going to give you some troubles. But if you get close enough to that, there's always nuance that it's going to be able to pick up on, right? And something that you can think of is maybe a brick wall that is really cleanly installed. Even that, if you're too far away, it's not going to pick up on enough nuance in those bricks to try and accurately align it. Sometimes you'll have misaligned images that I feel like I should be over here, where it certainly should not be over there.
Whoa.
Right? So a lot of the time,
didn't know
you
that.
can kind of solve these problems that do happen by getting closer. Right? You get closer and you start to bring out the nuance in that surface. So it does get confused. If you have something repetitive, it always is going to happen. But even in the case of my floor...
If the building contractor was like way too good at aligning those bricks, making
That's
them
right.
perfect, it would throw off the scan. That's crazy. Okay.
For sure. Yeah. Within reason, right? And it always comes down to the question of how close are you getting to this in order to capture that. Obviously, it's dependent on what the use of that scan is, right? Do you need to be close? If you need to be close, then you should be close anyways. But if you don't need to be close, you'll step away, and then you might start to run into those problems. And if you do, it's always good to come closer. Something I usually recommend people do is if you're doing a scan, do it twice. Like you can do a close-up scan and then a far back scan. And usually that's what we call a reference scan. It's basically capturing the whole thing as broadly as you can. That way, if when you get up and close, you miss a couple spots or your overlap in your photos aren't good enough, you always have that broader image to kind of reference and fall back on. And so it's something I recommend. It can help.
Right. Wow. Okay. And what about, let's say you've got a vase and like, I don't know, had a very unique surface, but it was just like very reflective or very pristine and white, and you knew it just wasn't going to scan. What can you like draw on it? Like
For
put
sure.
markers on it, or like, can that help?
Definitely, yeah. That's something that's quite common, especially when you reach these things that are like, okay, this is a vase and it's pure white. At the end of the day, we're not trying to capture a texture from that anyways because it's pure white. We'll just get a
Right.
model and then apply a material on it afterwards. And so a lot of time you try and justify or try and reason with it and how you want to approach scanning it. It comes down to value, right? So if the vase is something that you bought for $20-$50, spray paint is by far my favorite. Just get a couple cans of spray paint that are different colors and spray it down, just splatter it with paint, and there you go. You've got loads of key points to work with.
Yeah.
But there's sometimes where you don't want to do that, right? Because you can't just wipe away paint. Once it's dry,
Right.
it's kind of there forever.
That's right.
And getting it off is a bit of a hassle. But there's a handful of products developed specifically for that. So something that is you can think of as maybe glass or even chrome, stuff like that,
Okay.
are very
Yeah.
difficult for photogrammetry because again, it's looking for these points of interest. And if it's highly reflective or translucent, as you move around your subject, all those points move because it's a reflection, right? So there are some products that you can use that solve for this. I think the most common is ASUB, AESUB. It's an ASUB spray. It's a really cool spray. You spray it on. It's usually white, but you can get it in blue and orange, I think. And you spray that on, and it's essentially, it almost seems like dust. Like you spray it on, it's really funky. It's like this coating of dust. and it just helps to diffuse
What's
the
it
subject.
for? Is it designed for photogrammetry, is it?
Yes, yep. Specifically
Really?
designed for not just
Damn.
photogrammetry, but specifically designed for, I think, laser scanning, for laser scanners, because a lot of them, unless they're that blue light technology, they're going to have some issues with chrome surfaces and, translucent surfaces. So I'm pretty sure it's primarily designed for that, but it works in the same way for photogrammetry artists, right? You're going to try and spray it down, and you'll get a nice coating, and that'll add enough key points to your subject that you can start scanning it. But the cool thing about it is it completely evaporates. Once you lay it down, you have a few hours, and you can scan your subject in those few hours. And then after that, it slowly just starts to disappear. It doesn't leave any residue. It doesn't have any pigment in it. So it's not going to stain the subject that you're spraying it down on. So if you're working on something that's metallic or translucent, or it's just something that you don't want to cover in spray paint, these kinds of sprays are really useful. That
So it just evaporates.
Yeah.
But it's
like
enough to
magic.
give it texture that it can see it.
For sure. Yeah. It's
Wow.
like you can imagine having, a good way to explain how it looks is if you have your subject and you just sprayed it with like a spray glue and then threw flour at it. That's what it looks like when you've applied it to something, but instead of having flour glued all over your subject, it just disappears, which is really cool.
Wow.
I will say, though,
That's
ventilated
crazy.
areas,
Okay.
definitely, if you're going to use it. I made the mistake in this office. I don't have any windows in here, and I was just like, yeah, spraying away. And then I look up, and I'm like, holy smokes, what have I done?
You fumigated the room.
Pretty much, yeah. I hope my
ASAP.
landlord's not watching.
Damn. Okay. Got it. Wow. I mean, there's so many ways we could go. So that's a good starting point. But I want to take it back, actually. Not a lot of 3D artists get into photogrammetry. Maybe some are. Maybe some are curious on the side. How did you get started? What's your story?
Yeah, I mean, I got started with photogrammetry pretty early on in my 3D career in general. I started when I was 12, I think, in 2012. And I did a bit of 3D work, did the Architecture Academy, all that kind of stuff, right? Learned as much as I could. And then I started working at Blender Guru. Surprise, surprise.
Nice.
And yeah, I did a little bit of work on Grass Essentials, and then it was just a contract gig, right? Did a couple renders for that, and then continued on with my boring life. And eventually I was brought back to Blender Guru to work on the Rock Essentials. And that's when I learned about photogrammetry. It was, what is this, crazy technology that we're going to use to capture rocks, right? So when I was brought on for that, I was introduced to it, and I started off with like terrible camera. It was my mom's camera that had like an attached lens. It was so bad. But
Whoa.
yeah, I think that was probably back in 2015, and we started doing photogrammetry for rocks, right? Capturing entire models or capturing cliff faces to make brushes, and everything that we could. Essentially, it was the Rock Essentials. So did everything that you could. And back then, it was kind of like the floodgates sort of opened up with photogrammetry. Like you said, it's been around for a little while, probably since the 90s. And laser scanning, I know, has been around, I think, even longer. I remember seeing some stuff. They were doing some laser scanning on the first Lord of the Rings. That was pretty cool. But yeah, it's, I think around that time when we did Rock Essentials, it kind of really came to the scene, and we're like, holy smokes, like, this is really cool. The kind of details that you can get out of this are unmatched by any artist in the field, right? Pretty much. It feels, and I feel bad to say it sometimes, because there's this sort of notion that people have that photogrammetry is cheating in a way. But
Oh yeah, less so nowadays, I think.
for sure. Yeah, but I remember back
that's
then.
true. When it started, people were like, "No, you're going to put artists out of a job
Sure.
who were sculpting rocks previously."
Yeah. No doubt.
Which is
and you know
funny.
what? Like, I don't even think that's the case anymore, because we've scanned like really large stuff and really unique things with drones, but sculptors are not out of a job when it comes to rocks. Like, you'll still have a rock sculptor on every game, because you need that hero rock that, believe it or not, doesn't exist. You can't scan it, right? So photogrammetry, I think, serves as a really good aid for sculptors now, right? You can have photoscan brushes, and that, it saves them. And yeah, I think it's really cool. But yeah, that's kind of how I got into it, was Rock Essentials through Blender Guru. And yeah, my setup was pretty bad. I didn't have any lights or anything. I would just scan and like overcast outside and put up big pieces of white paper to try and bounce light. So that was fun. That was a very quick learning curve. It was like, how do do I get the best capture out of this, right?
Wow.
And
I didn't realize it was the rock essentials that started this
For sure.
obsession of yours.
That's exactly what it did. As soon as I think everybody who's done photogrammetry's kind of experienced this to a degree. The first time you scan something, first of all, it probably doesn't work. And then the second time you scan something and it does work, you're like, holy smokes, like, this is crazy. This is the coolest thing. I've got it here sitting on my desk, and now it's right in front of me. Like, it's wild. It's a wild feeling, and it is. You get hooked on it. Like, it's an addiction for sure. And like, there's days that I'm out and about. Just the other day I was out hiking with my partner, and one of the things, like, I'm a major nerd when it comes to rocks. Like, just ever since I became a scanner, it's like I'll be going anywhere and I'm like, wow, look at this rock, right? Like, it's such a nice rock. And I was chuckling, well, she was chuckling, because we're walking down this path, and I can just see the way that these rocks have crumbled off of the cliff face and kind of built up around the path. And I just stopped. I was like, just look at this for a second. Look at that. Like, you could study this for years and take so many reference photos of the way that the big rocks, piled together with the little rocks, and the way that the foot traffic that's gone through here has pushed these, and I just going on and on and on about it. And that's what happens, right? You lose it. You start going crazy. But it's cool. Like, that's one of the reasons I love photogrammetry, is because, you can study this kind of stuff for a long time to try and make it by hand, and you can, scan individual pieces. Like, okay, I'm going to scan the big rock and the little rock and the medium rock, and then I'm going to look at my reference and position them how I should. You can do really good. There's, environment artists out there that are phenomenal, right? But when you break it down, if you were to compare scan of that path that I was on versus somebody who tried to create it from reference, I'm sorry.
That's right.
Photogrammetry is winning every time. So it's an obsession that grows really quick. And starting off with rock essentials, my obsession with rocks has grown equally as my obsession for photogrammetry. I just can't get enough of them.
Yeah, that's right. I remember.
I have probably
it was
50 rocks here.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just
like
sitting
in your
my
room?
office. Yeah, I collect them. I just they're not even nice rocks. They're just like random rocks that I pick up from construction sites. I was like, wow, this is really cool. Just one of the things that's awesome about rocks. Here we go. I'm talking about rocks, but one of the things I love about rocks is they're very fractal, right? You can scan a rock that's like this big, right? Really, fairly small rock. But then if you scale it up, like, there you go. You've got a building block for a cliff. You just apply a detailed texture onto that, and you can go. So I collect all these things. I look at them and I'm like, wow, this could be a whole cliff or a mountainside. That's perfect, right?
Is that? I didn't actually know that. Wait, so it is, because I always thought, like, when you scale up a rock that was small and when you make it big, you could tell it's a small rock made big. But
100%.
The way it forms, you're saying it's fractal, meaning like what? The detail that's small is the same as detail that's large?
Yeah, within reason, right? Like, I wouldn't usually recommend, especially if you're working in a production, just scanning a little rock and scaling up and calling it a day. But, one of the biggest challenges with sculpting rocks in the first place is getting your primary forms, right? And getting that to look natural. And the way that rock breaks is quite similar from a large scale down to a small scale. It depends on the type of rock. There's some rocks that, that's not the case. But a lot of them, they're going to break quite similarly. So, yes, if you scan a small rock and scale it up, it's not quite going to cut it, but you're going to get yourself about 80% of the way, and then it's just down to using some scanned, brushes and ZBrush and adding some details in.
Yeah, wow, okay. So you would just, like, a detailed brush, meaning, like, I don't know, like a tiled rock map?
Not even tiled. Like, you just go out and find a cliff face and scan a patch of it, and then use that, right?
And then slap that on the old small rock. Interesting. I didn't know that. Okay,
yeah,
that's clever.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah, cool. Huh. So then why is Megascans like flying drones around scanning the cliff tops?
Well, it takes a lot of work out of texturing, I would say. Texturing is a big one, because texture doesn't scale very well, right? You're going to scale up your rock, and you'll get decent geometry, and then you'll sculpt on top of that. But because you're scanning a very small rock, the textile density is just not there to be able to scale up to this large asset. So you have to create the textures, and creating a realistic texture for anything is, very difficult for it to be believable. And with rocks, it's definitely like that. The way that the color relates to the different layers in the rock, and every little piece to the geometry relates to the color, very similarly. And so scanning something whole, one, it just means, if you're going to scan a giant, desert cliff rock, it's better to scan it because, one, it's more believable than having a small rock, scaling it up and adding detail, but you also have the color relation, which sells it, right?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. There is also something to be said of like just taking the headache out of the Q&A and like the design feedback, like, it doesn't feel right. Try this, try this. And it's like, no, if you can just go like, well, this is real life.
100%.
It's like, conversation's over, done. Either you scanned it or you didn't. So
yeah,
it is.
Yeah,
simple.
And that's where the conversation comes from too. Like when you start, I mean, as a 3D scanner, most 3D scanners are very problem solving and technical. They like to have challenges, right? And so we love these kinds of things. Like, just scan a small rock and scale it up. But there's a lot of time that goes into producing, a pipeline like that, and having to add, on top of a scan. It adds to it. And so definitely from a simplicity standpoint, just being able to scan the whole thing is super easy. But there's a lot of logistics. Right. Like when you get to something that large, you need to be able to fly a drone. So you're either sacrificing an image quality because you're using a little DJI drone camera, or you're using a giant drone where you attach a DSLR, and now you have to have a certified pilot to fly this drone. And then they also have to be smart and problem solving and good at photogrammetry in general. So they have to be a pilot that does photogrammetry, and it gets sticky pretty quick. So there's definitely, you have to balance it. It's always a question of like, okay, how are we going to approach this? There's always multiple ways you can do it, but I think always from a quality standpoint, just being able to scan it and call it a day, you can't beat it, right? You can't just beat, we scanned it. No questions asked. It's perfect.
Yeah. Huh. So you're talking about image quality. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Sure.
Gear. I'm sure you've changed. In fact, I know you have changed your gear several times over the years.
That's right.
What gear are you using today?
Today, well, I usually recommend people use mirrorless cameras. That's what I use. I've got some back here.
Why mirrorless?
Well, mirrorless, for one, it's a lot lighter and a lot more compact. So if you need to do traveling around the world, which is not uncommon for a photogrammetry artist, it's very easy to pack. It's very light. One of the other things is they have really impressive dynamic range. If you're not familiar with dynamic range, it's just essentially, I think they measure it with EV stops, but how much data they can fit from the darkest value to the brightest value. Some cameras, very low. If you can try and compare it to Blender, like back in the day before Filmic came in, you would start clipping pretty quick, right? And now that we have Filmic, it's very similar. The dynamic range of mirrorless cameras are very, very good, which means their low light capabilities are very impressive. So if you're having to photograph in darker scenarios, your image is going to be quite clear. But for the most part, like if you're comparing a traditional DSLR to a mirrorless camera, they're going to do the same thing. And there are DSLR cameras that perform just as well as mirrorless cameras. I mostly recommend mirrorless.
I thought DSLR included mirrorless. Are they separate things, are they?
They're separate, yeah.
I didn't know that. Damn. How are they different?
As far as I'm aware. Yeah. Well, DSLRs have a mirror. Mirrorless cameras don't.
Oh, damn. You have to make me sound so dumb.
Yeah, I think the industry in general has just moved to mirrorless. There's very few camera manufacturers that are like, let's put all of our money into making a new DSLR, because nobody really wants them. One of the reasons...
Wait, the DSLR industry is fading away.
Yeah, well,
being
you think
overtaken
about...
with mirrorless. Wow.
Yeah, well,
okay.
If you think about Sony, Nikon, and Canon, are they developing flagship DSLRs anymore?
I don't know.
No, not really. They're not.
I'm not a camera guy.
That's right, yeah. So
okay.
For the most part, they're not. Like Nikon has put all their money into the Z9, the Z7, the Z6, the Z8, the Z5, all that stuff. Sony has pretty much always been mirrorless, so they've got their A7, their Alpha series, right? And Canon has moved to their, I think it's the EOS R system. But pretty much all of these manufacturers have moved to mirrorless because, one, less moving components, because a mirror in your camera has to move. So a little more rigid, a little more sturdy there. But again, it's compact, it's light. And as a photogrammetry guy, you can't beat that. Like having a smaller, lighter package. One, it means you can get into tighter spaces that you might not have been able to with a larger camera. And two, when you're scanning all day and you're holding up a rig, it gets pretty brutal, right? And your arms.
I have heard from our photo scanning guys that their back hurts. Why does your back hurt? Explain that.
Well, not to roast any of our photogrammetry guys, but a lot of it comes down to posture, and I think I do it too. Like my back will kill me at the end of the day because having good posture when you're scanning is just goofy, man. Like it's just ridiculous. Because you can imagine, like if you're gonna hold a bunch of weight out in front of you, a lot of that stress it's gonna be on your shoulders and your arm, but it's gonna be right here on your back, where you're kind of all that load is pulling your back. And then if you're not bearing that weight properly, it's going onto your lower back as well because you're kind of going up and down like this, right? So there's a lot of weight that's being held out in front of you, and your arms can do a lot of that, but there's only so much that your arms can do and only so much that you want your arms to do because your arms, they're not going to last as long as your back is in terms of endurance, right? So your arms are starting to, I can't hold it anymore. So you put a lot of that weight on your back. You kind of lean back, bear that load a little bit, and you place it on your core. And so at the end of the day, especially if you're scanning grounds and lower down subjects or rocks and anything like that, you're getting low, it's a lot. It gets sore pretty quick. But a big part of it is posture, right? Like depending on what you're scanning, there's ways to hold your body that are much better for your back and your core. And most of us just don't do it because sometimes we're out in public and we don't want to look like a bunch of weirdos holding this big giant camera that's flashing away. And, it's goofy. Yeah. Pretty much, right?
Right. Yeah, got it. Okay. Okay, sorry. So you were explaining your gear. So, why don't you bring that camera over? We'll take a look at it. For people on the audio, Mason's got a weird-looking camera.
I can't tell if this is in frame because I can't see my... There we go.
It's barely in frame, but I think it is.
We'll take her one piece at a time. I'll pull out the camera here. So the camera that I specifically use, and this is what I've kitted out all of the scanners at Poliigon with, are the Nikon Z7s. Really awesome cameras. Everything you'd expect from a flagship camera, removable lenses, and extremely high-end lineup of lenses. But for us, the best thing about it, the dynamic range is great. So for having, clean linear images and linear color, as well as having support for low light performance, it's pretty much unbeaten. With that being said, you can go with a Sony, like a Sony A7 II or A7R2, A7R3, 4 or 5. They're all great. I like using Nikons. I like their menu better, but when it comes to flagship camera for scanning, Nikon or Sony, that's what I say. But I like using the Nikon Z7, and I believe it has some like 50, maybe 51 megapixels. So it's super dense, right? And it's 51 million pixels in your photo. It's like 8,000 by 5,000 or something like that pixels. So the images are very dense. And that means a couple things when it comes to scanning. Sometimes it means you can take less photos than having to take more with a smaller sensor. Other times it means that you don't have to get as close because it's just a denser image. You don't have to get as close to capture the same amount of detail you would need with a different camera. One of the reasons we like using these denser cameras or the denser sensors, is when you're doing scanning, kind of what I talked about in that they find points of interest, key points and tie points, areas of contrast, things that it can track throughout every image. The more pixels that you have, the more of those points it can find, right? So if I was to half this megapixel count, I have half of the megapixels to find key points and tie points in. And so if you jump this up to a higher resolution or a higher image sensor, you're able to capture far more tie points and key points, which makes aligning your photos, the initial reconstruction of your photos, that alignment, it can be a lot smoother than if you have a lower resolution camera.
So basically, if you had a cheaper camera or half the resolution, let's say, you could do the exact same photo. The captures would be the same, yet the software might not be able to align it and create the mesh.
Yeah.
Oh.
Certainly not as accurately too, right? Especially.
So it's almost like insurance. Like,
yeah.
I'm going to go out and shoot a bunch of stuff. I want to ensure that most of it is captured correctly, so I'm going to get the highest amount.
100%. And that's a big thing when it comes to photogrammetry, especially when you're in, production setting, is that a lot of the time you've been paid a full paid trip, right, to fly across the world and scan in this remote location. They're not going to be super stoked if you come back and your data sets haven't worked out, right? So you want to get there, and a general rule of thumb is just overshoot, shoot too many photos. You can always remove photos, but you can't add more photos in, right? And then the higher your megapixels, the better chance of that alignment going smoothly is. So it's definitely a battle. Like, you want to capture as much stuff as you can, but take your time, over capture, shoot too much stuff. And if you get back and have to remove photos from your set or down res your images, you can do that. But it's always better to try and cover all your bases while you can, because once you're back in your homeland, there's no scanning that rock again, right?
That's right. Interesting. Okay, so that's the camera. Oh, and what lens are you recommending?
For the most part, if people are just wanting to have a lens to do everything, I just say 50 millimeter. So I think the one that I've got on here, it's their Nikkor Z50 1.8S is the one that I use.
So that's a fixed prime lens.
Exactly, yeah. A lot of people, if you're starting out, a zoom lens is fantastic. But the thing is, when you're starting out, typically you don't want to blow your entire budget in one day. You're going to try and start out with something that is affordable for you, right? And so zoom lenses are very enticing, because this goes from 24 millimeters all the way up 200 millimeters. This covers everything that I need. But chances are, if you're buying a lens like that as your first lens, it's not a high-end zoom lens. It's going to be a kit lens or a base level lens. And the thing about zoom lenses is they have a lot of moving glass elements. And the more you add these glass elements, especially on the budget side of lenses, you start to get more dispersion, which results in a softer image.
Dispersion?
And so, light going through the glass, essentially, right? Maybe it's not the right term, but...
as in, how does that look like in a photo, dispersion?
It's just softer. The more elements of glass that your light has to go through before it hits your sensor, the softer that it's going to be, right? Unless it's really high-end glass.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So that's one of the reasons why zoom lenses aren't recommended a lot of the times, because it's just softer. You're not going to get as sharp of an image. So when you're starting out, I say buy a 50 millimeter lens and make it a prime lens and make it a high-end lens. So if you're going for a Nikon system, their S line, you can get this 50 millimeter S line lens, and as far as sharp prime lenses go, it's quite affordable. And
how do you know if a lens is good? That's what I have no idea. When it comes to lenses, when people are like, it's all about the lens, you got to get a good lens. I'm like, how do I know what a good lens is?
Right. Yeah. I mean,
just get the most expensive one?
No, I usually don't recommend that. But with cameras, with Nikon specifically, and this is one of the reasons why I might not recommend going with Nikon, is their lens system is fairly closed. So you're not going to get a lot of third-party lenses for Nikon. You're kind of stuck buying Nikon stuff. And so your pool of lenses to pick from becomes quite small, which makes it easy, because you just know, okay, well, I have to get this one because that's the Nikon one.
That's all there is.
Right?
Okay.
But within Nikon's lineup, there's different lineups of lenses. And what you're looking for is their premium lineup. So they'll usually have, whether it's Sony or Nikon or Red Dragon, right, or Sigma, whatever, they will have their premium line. For Sigma, it's an art lens. You want to go for their art lens. For Nikons, you'll go for an S line lens. So just do research for the camera and the lens mount that you have. Find, either the first party lens lineup that's high end, or if you're looking at a third party, what high end series do they have? And then it's just a matter of watching reviews over and over and over and over and over again, right? And just trying to figure out, okay, how does this look? But at the end of the day, you're talking about optics, right? It's just a matter of how really how sharp your image is, especially in photogrammetry. You want something that's sharp and true. You don't want something that has a lot of vignetting or something that has a lot of chromatic aberration, something that's soft. You want something that's sharp and clean throughout. And that's going to give you the best results. And so just looking at review channels, things like, what's that guy? I think he's Frono's Photos, something like that. This guy with a big afro, and he does reviews of cameras. Something he does a lot of the time is he'll do reviews of lenses, and then he'll give you sample photos, like the actual RAWs that you can download and inspect. So always look for stuff like that. Look for places that will provide you with a RAW of the camera that you're using with the lens that you want to use. Then you can start digging into it and go, okay, this looks really nice. But a lot of times it's like,
also, is it DP Review? There's a website where they take the same photograph with every lens, and then you can line them up and compare them side by side. That's also really cool.
Yep, that's a great one. So yeah, it's just a matter of, unfortunately doing some reading and some research to find what's best, right? But mostly it comes down to
the clearest lens is what you're looking for.
Clarity. Yeah, and that's not just in does it look sharp, because you can look at the center of a frame and say, yeah, that looks tack sharp. But you want to look at the edges, look at chromatic aberration. How's that light separating as it passes through the different elements in your lens? There's a couple things that play into clarity with lenses and optics. So,
got it. Okay. Okay. And what about the rest of your gear? Because you've got a crazy thing around it.
This here.
You see it in promo images sometimes, or promo videos. People walking around with this thing. So what is that?
Yes, this is a light. It's a ring light, and it's called a ring light because it's a ring. It goes around.
It rings around the lens.
That's right. There's a lot of ring lights out there, and they all generally serve the same purpose. It's just to light your subject, as any light would be. What we typically like to use these lights for is trying to remove baked-in lighting. And I'll talk about this light that I'm using in a second, but the reason that we use lights is if you've ever gone out and scanned something, especially, anybody who's starting out, whether or not you're a professional artist or you've just started doing 3D, if you go out and scan something, the first thing you'll immediately understand is that your scan, whatever lighting condition you scanned it in, your subject, it's going to have that lighting baked into it. So if you've scanned on a overcast day, it's going to be pretty perfect, right? There's not going to be a lot of directional light. There's maybe a bit of shadows and ambient light here and there, but it looks pretty good. But if you scan in direct sunlight or partly cloudy and you just have a bit of directional light, that's baked in. There's no getting around it. And so if you have to put that subject into a scene, into a project, into a game, it becomes less dynamic because the direction of the light on that subject is locked. It's baked in. It's not moving, right? It's whatever it was when you scanned it. And for the most part,
if it's very obvious, basically it means you can't change the lighting in the game.
For sure.
Or else it just won't match the rock.
For sure. And the other problem with scanning out in daylight without any, control over your lighting, which you're talking about weather, right? There's no controlling it, is you can't get accurate values either. Right? If you get into the depths of scanning and actually doing data acquisition, photographing, data acquisition for production, a big part of it is being able to control your light so that you can control other aspects of that surface. Controlling your light might mean that you can use cross-polarization, which is a whole topic we could probably talk about. But cross-polarization allows you to remove reflections from your subject, giving you a true diffuse reflectance value. And if you have uncontrolled lighting out in the world, you're not going to be able to do that. You can't polarize that light because you have no control over it. It's coming from everywhere. It's impossible. But if you can start to control your light, you're going to get a handful of things. You're going to be able to remove the need to delight stuff, which is when you've got a scan that has baked-in lighting, you have to go in and manually remove that baked-in lighting. And that can take a long time, and it'll never look as good as if it just didn't have that lighting in there in the first place. So
explain that, because every photogrammetry software seems to have this delighter where it will try to predict is a shadowed area of it, and then it just boosts it to try to level it with the lit area, roughly speaking. Why is that not as good as a ring light?
Yeah, it's a good question. First of all, you're still coming back to accuracy, and when you're working with PBR maps, there's, especially from a standpoint of just color to your light in general, right? The part of your subject that has light hitting it and the part that's in shadow have completely different lighting and color to that light. So like if you have a rock and it's sitting in the grass, the blue cast from the sky, the slightly orange cast from the sun, and then a green cast from the light that's bouncing off of the grass onto your shadowed areas, those start to cause problems. And you see this a lot. You start to try and adjust for shadow areas is when you bring them up, just bringing them up, it doesn't look right. It doesn't match. So you have to put a lot of work into color correcting for that area to try and get it to match the rest of your subject. And at the end of the day, even if you have a really good camera with a lot of dynamic range, those shadows are losing quality of data as they get darker, right? Same for highlights. The brighter you get, the less reliable that data is. There's a section, and a lot of people, you can really dig into this, but with cameras, there's a sweet spot. It's right in the middle of exposure, and that's where you want everything to be. Within there, that the usability of that data is solid. It's really good. But as you expand out towards the limits of your dynamic range, it's almost exponential, the loss of data that you have. So if you're trying to scan something in sunlight, something that's brighter, that's got direct sun hitting on it, you'll have to try and expose that to be, even exposure.
Right, yeah, true.
But once you've
exposed
exposed
the shadows are going to be really dark.
Yeah. And you might be able to raise them up and still have information there, but again, it's kind of exponential. Enough. The closer that you get to that end of that range, the worse that detail and that data is going to be. And the same thing for highlights, right? If you try and balance it and say, okay, well, I need some info in the shadows, so I'll increase my exposure so that I get better data from my shadows. You're going to have the same problem with highlights, right? The closer you're getting, it starts to clip, not fully clipping, but the range that section of your dynamic range is covering is less reliable. It gets it's a bit of a slippery slope. And so controlling your light, having that even, is the best possible solution. If you're working in a studio setting, you can just use any light. Like when I was starting off, I used desk lights and just clamped them on my desk and put them pointing directly at the subject from where my camera is, right? And then the light's always coming from your camera. But that's, generally speaking, what you want. You want your light to be coming from directly where your camera is, so that if you're looking at your subject, it's fully lit from your perspective, right? Like if you have a flashlight, this is a fun trick. If you have a flashlight and you just shine it down a path, look at like how much depth you're losing from just looking at the light. Like the trees all look like evenly exposed and everything looks flat because the light's coming directly from here, right? And it's the same thing with lighting a portrait, right? If you're lighting directly from the front, you lose a lot of information.
Everything flattens, yeah.
Exactly. But as you start to move the light around, you're getting the shadows and you can read the contour a lot better. But you don't want that with photogrammetry, right? What you're looking for is the flattest image possible, because that's what's going to be the truest representation of primarily your color, right? What you're doing this lighting for is just getting accurate color or diffuse information, because at the end of the day, the lighting doesn't have a huge impact on geometry. So if you don't care about what your texture looks like, you can scan in any lighting scenario, right? Obviously, if you start clipping into highlights or shadows, there's no information there. It can't track any tie points or key points, but it's still less of a problematic system. So we use ring lights a lot of the time to try and control our light. So the light's always coming directly from your camera source. These ones specifically, they're rebranded. I don't know who actually manufactures them, but they're sold by a handful of companies. If you're in the States or North America in general, Godox AR400s, that's what you're looking for. It's a fantastic ring light. If you're in other parts of Europe, you can look into Flashpoint, which is what I've got, even though I'm in Canada. I've got a Flashpoint. And this one is a Flashpoint something or other. It's the Ring Lion. Flashpoint Ring Lion. Other parts of the world, too, like if you're in India, you'll probably have a better chance looking for Quadralight. Quadralight's another ring light. They're all the exact same identical ring light, just rebranded by different companies.
Really? How do you know
they're phenomenal? Because we use them. We all have the same ones, right? So, yeah, that's what we use. They're called Godox AR400s or the Flashpoint 400s because they're 400 watts. They have an LED constant light.
Ooh.
It gets pretty bright, and that's nothing compared to like what you're actually going to see from this. I could flash it just for the fun of it, but these have controls, and they're called AR400s because they go up to 400 watts of light output in one burst. And you probably won't even be able to see this, but
wow,
it gets bright. And what this means is pretty much regardless of your lighting scenario in whatever area you're in, whether you're outside or inside, you can almost always overpower that light with this ring light. Meaning you can lots of the time scan in fairly direct sunlight and kind of counteract that light with this ring light.
So you could scan in the desert in like harsh sunlight and it would still remove your own shadow, because I imagine that's also an issue with sunlight.
It is an issue. Yeah.
So
it
does that
can.
remove like even that?
It can, but it starts to be a challenge. Because one of the things with these ring lights is the higher the brightness is, the hotter they get. And they have a cool down period. So you can, at max brightness, maybe shoot 100 photos, and then you have to step back and go, okay, I'll give it 5 minutes to cool off, right? The other issue is that the amount of light, right? Because the light is coming from your camera. Your camera floats right in here. If you move closer to the subject, your light's getting closer to the subject. And because you always want to scan on manual settings, not automatic settings, if you get closer to your subject, it gets brighter. Your image gets more exposed. You're talking about
manual for the camera.
Yes, yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And obviously, if you get farther away from your subject, the light that's hitting your subject from your ring light is dimmer. And so,
and this is just a point to stress on for the viewer. It's actually like exponential. It's called the inverse square law.
Yes.
So if you get twice as close to something, it'll be 4 times the amount of light.
Yeah.
And vice versa going backwards. So even slight difference in maybe getting slightly too close or slightly further from the subject will vastly impact how much light is being received, which is the big problem with the ring light. Yes. It'd be like, I was going to say, like, as people are hearing the ring light, they're like, excellent, this solves everything. It's like, it introduces more problems.
For sure. We're lucky, especially, today, the photogrammetry software that we use is quite smart, and they've caught on to the fact that lighting scenarios change throughout your subject, right? And so they do a really good job of leveling out your texture as it reconstructs it. So unless you've really messed up and you've had a good amount of variance in there, it should work out just fine. But there still could be a gradient, right? Like if in one part of your subject you just got closer and slowly moved away, like part of your subject is going to be brighter. It's not ideal. So you do want to keep it locked in as close as you can. But kind of in the vein of that? Practice. There's forms of measurements, right? So if you want to really get into it, you can build out some laser measuring tools that attach right to your rig and shoot a laser out, measure your distance from your camera to your subject and give you a little readout. Like, you can build those things, right? Like it's something that you can use, but for the most part, what I've found is practice. Just practice makes perfect, and be very, very critical. Like, people think you can just go out and take a bunch of pictures and call it a day. Throughout your scan, like, you feel really rigid. You feel very like, okay, here we go. I'm locking in. We're scanning. Keep this distance. Keep the pattern moving. Keep the coverage. Everything has to be good, right? And the distance from you to your subject is one of those things where you're looking at it. All right, I'm about maybe 1.5 feet away. Okay, let's go. And you just try and keep that throughout your scan, right? And it gets brutal, like, especially if you're having to like reach up a lot and, get into weird positions. Maybe there's a tree up against your rock that you have to, try and work around. You don't have enough space to move your camera. It gets sticky, right? But what you have to understand is you have control over your light, right? If you have to move closer to your subject, reduce the brightness of your light. Problem solved. But you have to be conscious of it.
If you happen to get like in, I don't know, like a cavity under the rock or something, and you can tell you can't get in there, you could go like, all right, I'm going to be twice as close, so I'm going to drop it by 4, a factor of 4.
Yep.
Interesting. Okay, that's clever.
Sure.
I didn't know you did that.
Yep.
I thought you just
definitely.
like picked a light reading and just kept it. No, okay.
No, for the
Right.
most part you can, right? But it depends on your subject. And the thing about doing that
Yeah.
is most of the time when we talk about a variation in distance, it's a problem because we're not conscious of it. It's human error. As we're scanning, we're accidentally getting closer or farther away from our subject. And that's what starts to cause
right.
problems.
Especially as your back starts to hurt and you're like,
Yeah.
I'm not going to get as, I'm just going to start stepping further back so I get
Yeah.
more of it.
No doubt. If you're on your 20th rock of the day, it's not going to be the best one. The best scan is usually the second scan of the day, is what I say. The first one, you're like, okay, I've just rolled out of bed. You warm up, and then you get to your second
Right.
scan, and you're like, that's the one. So
That's
you
it.
you do a little bit of scouting in your area and pick out your favorite, and like that's going to be the hero right there. That'll be my
Right.
second
You make
scan.
that your second scan. Okay.
Yeah. But kind of this conversation of getting closer to your subject, if you need to scan, like back to talking to direct sunlight in a desert, if you need to scan in that scenario, it means you have to get really close to your subject in order for that light to be powerful enough to remove the lighting from the surrounding area. And the way you do it, right, like people want to know how to set these lights up a lot of the time. Common error is to just crank it up to the max setting and then adjust your camera from there so that it's exposed well from the distance that you want to shoot at. And that's never what I recommend doing. What I would usually recommend doing is adjusting your camera settings, because you're in manual camera settings. You'll adjust those, first of all, for good photos, something that's going to be sharp. So if you're familiar with like the triangle of camera settings, it's shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. You want to always balance those so that you get a good quality image. But what you're doing is you're going to expose your camera until you don't see anything, just the point where it's pure black. And once you've reached that pure black point, it means that the lighting in your area is not being picked up by your sensor. Then from there, you will increase the brightness of your ring light until you're properly exposed. That way, you're shooting at a good control, right? If you just crank your light up all the way, it's like, yeah, let's go. You're going to have overheating issues, right? Like at full brightness with these ring lights, you're going to get 100 photos before you have to cool down. And that can take, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. So,
and it just doesn't work when it's hot?
It depends on the model. Some of the newer ones, I think people were complaining because they would get a warning, it's overheating. But they were like, well, I can still take pictures, right? So they would keep doing that, and then I think they were breaking. So now they've started building it so that when it overheats, it just shuts down completely, and you physically cannot turn it on until it's cool enough, right?
Okay.
Because the pro trick back in the day was like, it's overheating, turn it off and on again, and it forgets that it was overheating, right?
Oh, really?
So,
nice.
Yeah,
You
mine's
just
one of
power
those.
Pass it, burn
and
out
I'll just
all the lights.
That's right. Yeah. No, mine's one of the old ones, and I'll do that sometimes. Like, it's not responsible, but like if I'm like 4 photos away from finishing my set, I'm like, screw it. I'll just turn it off and on again. 4 extra photos isn't gonna hurt it, right? Yeah. And I feel bad for some of the artists now who have the new ones where it's like they get to like 5 photos away from their set, and they're like, it's overheating, and then I have to sit down and like, I'm so close.
What do you do when that happens, where for whatever reason, like, I don't know, you're shooting on a path and that like a whole tour group happens to walk through and you have to stop for, I don't know, 5-10 minutes, or overheating? How do you remember where you were on the rock, let's say?
Yeah,
just by eye, just like
for
about here.
A lot of the time, they'll do it by eye. It's a funny scenario though. Like, this is when you start to really look like a crazy person when you're out and scanning. Is you see a hiking group, because if they come in and start kicking rocks around on your ground, that's all stuff that you've already scanned and now it's moved around. It needs those points to track, right? And you're like, don't walk here, walk around, please. Because if they walk over, it's like, all right, start over, right? But yeah, if you're like in the case of overheating, if you've overheated, usually what I do is I just don't move. I can like relax and sit back, but I don't move my feet, right? Where my feet are is my truth. If I keep my feet here, I know that, okay, I'll just look back down and start scanning again.
So you'll stay exactly where you are for 5 minutes?
Yeah, sometimes. Other times, I'll just, make a big mental note of it and be like, this thing right here that I'm looking at, first of all, I have a picture of where I was. Second of all, I'll just try and look at the spot and be like, okay, remember this rock. It looks fun. I like this rock. Keep that rock in my mind. And then I can go and sit down, right? But a lot of the time, you kind of just, you're out there with other people too. And you just, okay, let me relax, sit back here and just relax my back, do a little bit of this, a little bit of that. take the polarizer off, let it really cool out, and then just have a chat, right? But it's funny, like the whole thing of spectators, I guess, bystanders walking through, like, scanning grounds is so scary a lot of the time for that reason, because we talk about key points. If it's tracked at this point in the corner, and this point in that corner, and this point in the center, if one of those points gets kicked, like a rock that it's tracking, it gets kicked, it's game over. It loses that. So if you have a group of people... What about
if a leaf just falls on the path?
It can. It's not that sensitive, right? So, like, things like that, not a big issue. But if you have a group of people who just walk over your... I'm like, oh, okay. That's probably toast, right? But, yeah.
Yeah.
Bystanders are fun. If you get into scanning, like, the amount of weird looks that you get. I've had the cops call on me 4 times now, just in, like, normal, North America, just out here in Canada, in a normal spot. Like, nobody's asking questions, really. But, yeah, I had the cops call on me a number of times. And people
were they there with you going like, I'm calling the cops? Or was it just like an anonymous person called the cops?
No, I only had one scenario where somebody like confronted me. Well, I had 2. One scenario where somebody confronted me like very aggressively. Luckily, it was like a really old lady. But I was in a park taking pictures of a tree, and she comes up. She's like, I know what you're doing. And I'm like, I'm sorry? What? She's like, you're taking pictures of people's license plates. You're taking pictures of people. I'm like, no, I'm sorry, I'm taking pictures of this tree. I'm a blah, blah, blah. This is what I do, right? She's like, no, that's not what you're doing. I'm like, would you like to see my photos? Like, I'm like, seriously, I'm taking pictures of a tree, right? But she was heated. She didn't call the cops on me, though. But when people do call the cops, like, they don't want a confrontation. They're usually, like, out in their house looking out the window like, what in the world is this guy doing? It's crazy, right? So
what do the cops say when they get there?
They're usually pretty cool. I don't like cops for the most part, but whenever I've had them called on me for scanning, like, they'll come up and be like, hey, we got a couple calls. What are you doing? I'm like, okay, I'm a 3D artist. I do something called photogrammetry. I take 1,000 photos of this rock and then turn it into a model, right? And they're like, sick, that's cool, right on. And then they go about their day. Because, obviously it depends on where you are, but for the most part, if you're in a public area, you have every right to photograph. Even if you wanted to photograph somebody's face. Right? Yeah. They're in a public spot. You're allowed to photograph as long as it's assumed to be public. So,
which is odd because it's like you don't even need to answer anyone really.
Yeah.
Even the cops, theoretically, right?
Yeah.
Unless
You'll get in trouble for that.
I don't know, a bridge, like taking photos of the structure of the bridge might look a little bit suspicious, but
no, even still, you can do whatever you want. It doesn't matter.
But there would probably like anti-terrorism charges is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah. My general rule of thumb is you can photograph anywhere you want that's public and daylight out there. Just, I say, stay away from parks and playgrounds and stuff like that where there's children playing. Because people definitely, I've never even tried in daytime. Like, I usually wait until it's nighttime because we use lights for scanning. We can scan at nighttime. So
that looks very suspicious.
It's super suspicious, but there's nobody there, right?
So you're out in a playground at light, and someone just sees this like insanely bright flash just keep going off.
Yeah,
that's fun. Okay,
it's nice. Another thing with it is like with using a light is you have to be, respectful of people's, boundaries and potential health risks. Like if you have a big light that says flash, flash, flash. If people have what's that? Where they get seizures all the time from light.
Epilepsy.
Epilepsy.
True.
That can be a risk for sure. Even for yourself. Like, I don't have epilepsy, so when I'm scanning at night, I don't have any like really bad reactions to it, but it can be jarring. You're like, okay, wow, this is just a light just flashing in my face over and over and over for an hour, right? But a big part of that too is like, never scan with these lights near a street that is being driven on. Like if you're flashing and somebody's in a car driving by, like, holy smokes, these things are insanely bright, like ridiculous. So you got to be
you could disorient people.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So you shoot at nighttime? I didn't know.
A lot of the time, yeah. Well, again, although these lights can control your light or the light in your scan really well, there's still a range that you are comfortable with using in terms of brightness on your light. If it's direct sunlight, you have to crank it all the way up to the max, and you're having those overheating issues, and you're running out of battery power, right? So it's still always best to scan in overcast scenarios. So when it's overcast, the light isn't super strong, super bright, super direct. Then you can scan it like a quarter power on your ring light and get far more life and, shots out of it before it runs out of battery or overheats. And if you're in an area or a season of the year where it's just like clear and sunny every day, you don't have a lot of options. Option one, scan in the mornings, in the evenings, or nighttime, and just try not to look super suspicious. Or you can be crazy and bring around like pop-up tents, like market tents, stuff
those.
like that.
Yeah. Like a marquee.
Yeah. So those can be really helpful, especially if you're like out in the field. Most like studios.
So that's if it's like super bright, like desert, hard sunlight. Okay. Yeah.
And a lot of studios, they don't really. I think sometimes they can't ask employees to like stay up until midnight and scan overnight. Right. So it's like, okay, well, think of some ways that you can block out your sunlight. And a lot of time, tents and umbrellas. I built something like that when I was younger, and we didn't have ring lights. I just got a microphone stand and duct taped a umbrella to it and was like, block the sunlight.
Nice. True. Interesting.
As you can tell from listening to this interview, photo scanning is a lot of work, which is partly why companies like mine, Poliigon, exist. Poliigon has invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into a pipeline to ensure that we deliver consistent, high-quality, production-ready assets. So we've hired teams of people to go out there, scan content, and then develop pipelines to ensure that everything's normalized, all the de-lighting is there, everything is correct, and then it's put onto the website where you can access it for cheap, usually like $2 or $3 an asset each. We've recently launched Photoscanned Marble as well as Photoscanned Wood Veneer, and of course we've got all of the usual fan favorites of photo scanning: rocks, foliage, tree stumps, stuff like that. So that is all available at Poliigon, Poliigon.com, at a consistent, very high quality standard bar. So hope to see you there. Now back to the interview.
Yeah. Okay. Now let's talk about, because the other thing that you mentioned it briefly, polarizer. So the ring light is obviously shining reflections all over your image, which you don't want because that confuses the sensor. It doesn't know where the data is or whatever. So you are putting a polarizer on the ring light and another one on the lens, and that cancels each other out, removes most of the reflection.
Most, if not all, right? It's all dependent on the quality of your materials that you're using for polarizing, but it does a really phenomenal job. And a big part of it is removing the reflections so that it doesn't mess with your subject, right? It doesn't mess with the alignment of your photos. But if you're photographing something that's fairly diffused, it doesn't seem like it's a problem, because we scanned without polarizing for a long time, and we still do in scenarios where we can't polarize, right? It's not going to ruin the alignment unless it's like really shiny or wet. Mostly what you're doing is, when you think about 3D rendering, especially with PBR now, you have these different maps to your material, right? You have your diffuse map, and you have your metalness map and your roughness map. And your shader is adding in reflections. So if you scan a color map that has reflections on it, and then you add more reflections on top of that, you're not getting an accurate representation of the subject, right? And it starts to feel uncanny. So really the primary reason we like to do polarizing is to get a true representation of the diffuse reflectance, the color of your subject. Because you're going to have those reflections added in your shader. You don't want to capture your subject with those reflections on there. And so we have a polarizer that's on your lens. You can buy, like, polarizers are super common for photographers in general, not just photogrammetry. So you get a polarizer, 9 times out of 10 you can probably find the lens that you want pre-packaged with a polarizer, just a bundle deal. I do say it's always good, like, buy a high-end one, right? Like, you want to make sure that your polarizer for your lens is good quality. So my go-tos are Hoya or Haida. Hoya or Haida. Those two are my favorite. Really, really good quality. That's for your lens, it's circular polarizer, and then you'll have a polarizer for your light. And you'll do that in as many scenarios as you can. Specifically for their ring lights, we have custom-built, like, 3D printed mounts that screw directly to our rings and have a custom cutout polarizer. But you would do it for any light that you have. Just
why do you need that, actually? Why don't you just, like, tape it. Because actually, Joe was asking me the other day. He's like,
Yeah.
I need a 3D printer so that I can print out these lens mounts. I'm like, can't you sticky tape it? Because it's based, like, for people who don't understand, it's like you buy this film. It literally just looks like what's the word? Like that colored film that you can see through, sellotape.
Anyway, something like that. Yeah.
It looks just like that. It's just gray. Why can't you tape it to a ring light and call it a day?
Well, the ring light specifically, the light goes like edge to edge. So you don't have like a bezel around your light that you can work with to tape to.
Okay.
And if you have tape on top of or even behind the polarizer, that tape affects the polarization. It's not a clean polarizing. So you want to have the light just go right through your polarizer and nothing else. And that's going to give you the best results. But you can tape it. Like that's what we did for these ring lights before I started printing off these custom ones. So there are a couple reasons we use them. One, if we look here, I don't know if people are going to be able to see this, but this mount has slots on it.
Okay.
And that allows air to freely move across the lens of the light. Because if you trap all of that heat in there, it's going to overheat faster. So when we used to tape them to the front, there's no ventilation for the heat to dissipate off of the front of your ring light. So
interesting.
That was an issue. It also starts to not melt, but it starts to soften your polarizer quite a bit. And the other thing is like you want to avoid wrinkles. Like you want your polarizer to be as flat as possible. Because if it's got warbles or wrinkles in it, again, the angle that the light comes out of that is varying across the surface. So the flatter it is, the better. You don't want anything interfering with the polarization of it. You just want a nice, flat, clean, straight through. The other thing, too, is if you tape it, it's fixed, right? It's on there. You can't take it off unless you remove all the tape and remove all, get all the residue all over. Nobody likes tape. I hate tape. So these ones that we have are magnetic, right? The front element comes off. What that means is you can actually rotate them. So I can rotate this one 90 degrees. And that's really helpful because when you rotate the polarizer, these ones on the front of our rings are linear polarizer. We use the laminated linear polarizing sheets from polarization.com. It's where I recommend everybody get their polarizer. Is that really
where it's from?
Yeah.
Polarization.com.
I'm pretty sure, yeah. Polarization.com.
That domain. Okay.
Yeah, there you go. Not a sponsor, but that's the one to go to.
Nice.
So yeah, we use those, and what that means is the linear, when you rotate them, you can align your polarization with your circular polarizer on your lens, and you'll have full cross polarization. So when you have the light polarized and the image sensor polarized, your lens polarized. If you rotate the light, the film on your light, now you're dealing with linear polarization where only one of them is polarized because you've twisted it 90 degrees. The light that's coming out of your light is no longer aligned with the circular polarizer on your lens. So just rotating it means you can go from having no reflections at all to letting all the reflections in. And this is really valuable when you're working with PBR maps and trying to get good reference for your shader. You can take two photos. Take one with cross polarization, remove all reflections, and then take an identical photo with the polarizer flipped 90 degrees to let that reflection in. Then
but
you
you're
can
not doing
run
that for every photo. That's
No.
just like a few reference shots.
No, especially not if you're doing handheld, right? If you're doing handheld out in the field, it's very difficult to keep consistent, rotate the film every time, and have your photo be perfect. Because if that image changes at all between the cross-polarized and the linear polarized, that extraction isn't going to mean anything, right? So it needs to be pixel perfect between the two. So a lot of the time, this is insane, but a lot of the time there will actually be like two different scans that happen. Some people have rigs where they have two cameras and two ring lights, and one's polarized and one isn't. And when they shutter, it takes two photos, one with one camera, one with the other. And you have two completely separate scans, one that's cross-polarized, one that's linear polarized. So then you can just take the entire texture.
They're holding this rig with two. So that's
exactly.
Wait, it's two cameras.
Yeah. Sometimes.
Damn.
Sometimes they just have two lights, right? But in a lot of scenarios, you'll have two cameras, and what you end up with is two scans, one that is cross-polarized, one that's linear polarized, and then you can run that extraction on the entire texture.
That sounds overkill.
It is, right?
That sounds way intense. Too much work.
So most of the time what you do is you'll just take reference photos of cross and linear polarized at different, key characteristics of your shader, of your subject. And then for the rest of your scan, you'll just shoot cross-polarized and essentially eyeball the rest of the material based on your reference, right?
So you're meaning like once you've got your scan with the color information, you would, in Photoshop or something, you would put it in grayscale and kind of estimate a correct glossy roughness value or something.
Sure, yeah, that's definitely a good way to go about it. If we're doing it in Photoshop, which is definitely the most approachable for anybody, just going into grayscale, isn't going to give you the best results, because the darkest value on your subject might be the shiniest in one area, but then in a different area, the darkest part of, let's say, a rock isn't the same level of shiny as this dark area. So just having let's make it grayscale and match the values roughly doesn't quite cut it. So typically what I do is I will take, I've been working on scanning this. This guy is a crazy looking carving knife, but there's, throughout the grain and the wood in here, there's a lot of different values that do correspond to the reflection. So what I do is I'll make it grayscale, but before I do that, I'll do color selections in Photoshop. It's a really quick and dirty way to do it. Is you'll just go up to select and do color selection and find the range that you're looking for. This color selection of this part of the leather, and it'll select everything that is that same color, and then you'll just copy that and put it in its own layer. And then you can grayscale that and adjust it to the right value to match your reference.
I see.
And you'll do that for every different element. Like the metal's going to have its own, the leather's going to have its own, this part of the grain's going to have its own. If there's some paint splattered on it, it's going to have its own.
Yeah.
Right? Because as you go through different materials, or even a like material, right? Like on a rock, it's not necessarily 0 to 1, like just make it grayscale and match the overall median value. It's not necessarily going to cover you. It'll get you super close. Like if you just want to make a quick asset to throw into your library that you can use for your personal projects, make it grayscale, adjust the contrast and brightness until it looks good for your project, and you're off to the races. Like it's a really great way to do it. But when we're talking about
is sampler any better? Substance sampler?
Substance sampler, it can work a lot of the time. When you're dealing with models specifically, at least last time I used it, it introduces seams into your model because it doesn't recognize where the shells are for your UVs. It works really well with tileable materials, but I haven't used it in a little bit. It's very possible that it's doing really well right now. Typically, what we'd actually end up doing is using something like Substance Designer. Is you'll create a tool set in there that can generate the roughness maps for your subject. Based off of these types of color selections, and you can even build out presets for any node trees that you've built out, and that can do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. But at the end of the day, I almost always just opt for Photoshop. Like it's tried and true. It's just easy to use, easy to control, and it does the trick, especially if you're just getting started out. Like it's kind of intimidating to get into something like Painter or Designer especially Designer, if you haven't used it before, and like diving into all those nodes, it's like, holy smokes. Like, I don't know how I'm going to build this out, right? So doing it in Photoshop, like color selection. Yeah, select that.
Yeah,
Make it match, right?
Got it. Okay, so that's one thing that's like an estimate, and that's the other thing. It's also like, you can go like way too technical and go but it's not going to match. It's like nobody on the planet will know that rock is not exactly the correct gloss of the color changes that correlated to the gloss. I think that's probably the best approach. So what else is so there's the normal and the displacement. I guess that comes down to like, obviously when you're processing it, you're getting this high resolution information, and then it's up to you as to like, what are you baking into a normal map, and then like decimating the mesh down to, I guess. And that's all just part of the process.
For sure.
How's that done?
Like getting to a final asset, like having final geometry and baking those maps. Yeah. So many ways to do it, right? There's a lot of ways to do it, and it's going to come down to the needs of your application, right? Like if you're working in something like Unreal and you have nanite, you might not worry about generating LODs ever. You'll probably just get a raw scan, decimate it down to a usable poly count, right? Like you're not going to throw a 500 milli polygon mesh into Unreal. It can probably handle it, but it's going to
But
take
not
forever
smart.
to load it in. It's just not a good idea.
Yeah.
So you'll decimate it down to something reasonable and then bake those maps. And you can do that really with any software. Like you can decimate it down in MeshLab or just decimate it down in your, photogrammetry software of choice. Reduce it in there and then bake those maps out, whether you're using Marmoset or Painter or XNormal or whatever, right? You'll just bake those down to that mesh. And for nanite, you're done. 9 times out of 10 it's gonna do, unless you have really strict budgets for your game or your project, right? But what we do, like at Poliigon, we always want to focus on having LODs, not just for use in like a real-time application, but just for support for maybe people who don't have the highest end machine, right? They can't load in nothing but these 5 million polygon meshes. They want to have lower things for the background, anything like that, right? So we try and generate a series of LODs, levels of detail, for that subject that range, anywhere from 5 million down to a couple hundred polygons in your mesh. The challenge that we always run into doing that is trying to preserve UVs. You don't want to have an entire material set for every LOD, right? Because if you think, let's just say, 5 maps for your material, and let's just say, you have color, metalness, roughness, normal, displacement, AO, right? It gets pretty deep pretty quick. Right. And if you had...
Because you'd have to generate those 5 maps for every single LOD, which could be 6, so now you've got 30 maps.
Yeah.
Right. So that's why you need to share the UV shell space. They need to be the same, but that's often not easy to do.
It's not easy, and at the end of the day, it's impossible. You can't do it flawlessly. You want to get it as close as possible so that as you're moving down that LOD chain, LOD 4 or 6 is going to look like crap compared to the top LOD, and there's going to be some variance in that UV shell. But you want to get it as close as possible, right? There's a tolerance that you find in that, this is a LOD 4. It should really only be in the distant background, something that you're not looking up close, right? So it's going to hold up just fine if that UV shell's off a little bit. But it's very important because you don't want to have all of those maps for every single LOD, right? The only one that you do have for every LOD is the normals, because the normal map is very dependent on the topology of your subject. So obviously if you have a 200 million or 200 polygon mesh and a 5 million polygon mesh, if you put that 5 million polygon mesh
normals, in
it's almost
the low one.
It's like using a fine normal map on a super low res model. It doesn't work, right? So you have to have that. That always has to be unique. But it's a big one, is trying to maintain that. And there's a lot of ways to do that with LODs. There's many ways to approach a LOD system. One of the ones that we've used, and I believe there's a workflow to do it in ZBrush, is this concept of going from high to low, back to high, and then back to low, which is very confusing. Essentially what you'll do, because you want to preserve these UVs, if you were to just take a 5 million polygon mesh and UV unwrap it, first of all, it takes forever to UV unwrap because it's super dense.
Sure.
The UV maps are going to be really dirty because there's all these little crevices and it's a nightmare.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
But then imagine all those tiny little islands, all the sharp jagged edges to those UV shells. If you're trying to reduce that down to 200 polygons, there's no hope ever for a 200 polygon mesh to accurately recreate the 5 million polygon.
You might have more islands than you do polygons.
Yes, that's right. So it's a bit of a headache. So what we've tried is going from high, we'll decimate it down to something low or remesh it. Right? You can use a remesher. Blender's got remeshers built in now that are really nice. So you can use a remesher so that it's low poly, close to your final target for one of your lower LODs, right?
Sure.
So let's say, I want to shoot for a LOD 4 resolution. So remesh it to there, then UV unwrap it. It's super clean, super nice UVs. You have as few UV islands as possible, and you don't have any crazy, it's a lot easier to do, right?
Okay.
From there, you can take the detail from your high poly mesh and project it to that subdivided, or not subdivided, but remeshed version, right?
Okay.
So you can do that any number of ways. You can do a shrink wrap or a reprojection or even a displacement map. You can bake a displacement map and then apply that to your newly remeshed and UV unwrapped subject. So now it's beautiful and high poly again, and it has all the detail of the original. Now you have a high poly mesh that looks like the original, but has super clean, low poly style UVs that are easy to poly decimate down to get something that is easier to maintain, right? There's problems to that.
That is so complicated.
Yes, and there's
That's
a lot
insane.
There's pros and cons to every workflow, and what you find with this workflow is that you have cleanup work, right? Rarely are you going to bake a displacer map or do your projection and be like, yeah, it's perfect. It looks just like the source scan did. It's beautiful. You're going to have like weird spikes going everywhere, especially areas that are close and occluded. They're going to project all weird, and okay, I got to go into ZBrush, clean this up, and get it usable. But it's almost unbeaten when it comes to preserving UVs and in terms of maintaining quality across your log chain to avoid popping, which is when the LOD switches out. You want to avoid any jarring changes. It's really good for that. It does a really good job.
Damn. That's insane. I think studios, though, just use Polygon.
No.
That's what Steven's saying.
Well, it depends,
No?
yeah. And certainly you wouldn't just use Polygon for photogrammetry data. Polygon's great for like a man-made asset, because if you think about let's say a really high poly character, like, okay, Master Chief's chest plate, right?
Okay.
It's super high poly, but it's still built in a man-made sense where it has clean edge loops, it has clean UVs from the get-go, and everything's clean. It's very easy to reduce from there because you already have that. That's what you've shot for.
Sure.
But with photogrammetry data, there's never that, a person plotted this out. Yeah. Everything's filthy, right? And the UVs that come out of your, especially if you're using reality capture, like, I love reality capture, and I am actually using it in my personal work, but the UVs that come out of reality capture are embarrassing. And if you tried to put that through Polygon, never in 100 years is that going to work, right? So there's a lot of, photogrammetry is very different from reducing for a man-made subject, right? Hand-modeled assets and stuff like that, far easier to produce LODs for, because you basically put it through Polygon, and it's a phenomenal tool. Like, I'm not trying to dog on Polygon. Like, Polygon is really awesome. But you can't just take a raw scan, throw it in there, and be like, simplify it. It doesn't work. It's never going to work.
I was imagining Polygon as this, like, magic box that just does all the work for you.
I'd love that.
Turns out it's not.
No, it's not. It's pretty magic. It does some really great reduction. But at the end of the day, it's a reduction tool. It does a great job of taking a lot of the manual work out of doing reduction and baking different maps. And it does a really good job. But
so what are we using for our LODs? Is it Houdini?
Yep, we use Houdini for the majority of our pipeline. Typically, we'll use...
And that was a very expensive tool to build. Just so for people listening, they're like, I'll use Houdini to make my LODs. Maybe don't.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not worth it.
It depends, right? It depends on what you're shooting for. But I think like Houdini is really powerful in that you can achieve a lot with it in one application and not have to jump to multiple tools, and you can automate it very well. So like once we get our raw scan data at Poliigon, we can throw that into Houdini and in 10 minutes have all of our LODs, all of the UVs match, everything looks beautiful, and you're ready to bake your textures, right? It goes really quick, and it does the work really well, right? But developing the tools in Houdini to do that can take some time. I can't remember, but I'm still making updates to it, and I started working on it, I don't know, 2018 maybe, right? And so it's been a while, and it's always changing, but that's the kind of thing that's valuable in a production, right? If you're just making stuff for your own personal library, definitely don't spend $4,000 on a Houdini license and then spend years developing this perfect majestic thing if all you're doing is getting quick scans to throw into your environment, because you just don't need it, right? Yeah. But if what you want is to become a senior in a production and working as a photogrammetry artist, a big part of that is having an efficient pipeline. And if you have the skill sets in a tool like Houdini that you can bring to the table, it's really valuable, right? If you have experience developing pipelines, that's really good. So if what you want is to break into that industry, you can do it just as like a photographer, right? And all you do is data acquisition. You take really great photos, and you know how to process it to a final asset, just maybe not as automated and as efficient as they might want. You can still get a job, But having that experience of building an automated tool, something that takes a lot of the manual work out of it, is really valuable, because it's always just, you have to balance it, right? But it's always, if you spend this time up front to develop this tool, maybe you're going to spend a year developing it. But now next year, when you have 5 photographers who are all putting their data through this pipeline, instead of it taking 10 days to make an asset, it takes 1 day to make an asset, right? So building these efficient tools are really good. It's just a matter of, do you have the time or money to invest into building the tool?
And exactly, and also the volume of work. Like if somebody is just listening and they're like, I've got a few, I'm an archivist artist, like Phil on the team. I want to just maybe scan a few vases just for myself. It's probably you don't need a tool. You could just, do a retop. You don't even need LODs, really. Just like one LOD, that'll do.
Yeah, for sure. And like Phil's scans are gorgeous. Like I've taken a look at them. They look amazing. I'm like, these are beautiful. And they work really good for ArcViz. But if you want to make something that's flexible, or it needs to go into a game and it needs to have this chain that works efficiently, then the depths at which you go to achieve that, you sell your soul to side effects.
Yes.
Show me the ways.
Side effects licenses are not cheap.
No.
Every time you send me an invoice of like, they need another license. By the way, also side effects, update your payment process. What are you guys doing?
Anybody listening?
But like sending people like a PDF with like deposit this money into this bank account.
It's like, shady.
I know, it's so shady. I'm like, what?
Yeah, that was the first thing I asked.
Got to put it in US dollars, even though we're a Canadian company. I'm like, well, what?
What are you talking
Where's
about?
the form where I can just like put in my credit card info, like
a
every other
portal.
company?
Please, hello.
Yeah.
Super bizarre. They do have payment portals online. When you first buy your license, it's really easy.
Oh yes,
but I think
for your
because
first one, renewals. Yeah.
For us, it's because we have this like GAL license, which is a global access license. Basically, just means if I have it on my machine here in Canada and then I sign off, it can then be accessed by somebody else in wherever in Turkey, or right. They can open it up anywhere. It's global access, and I think for that specific license, they're really picky about like they just don't have a portal for it. You can't buy it off of their site. You have to talk to a rep, a sales guy, and he puts together a license for you, and then that's what you get, right?
Yeah.
But if you're just if you're an individual and you're just I want the indie core license, you can. There's an online portal, and you should be able to renew it with that AUP every year without any problems. Yeah.
Got it. All right, cool. Let's because we talked about gear, we've talked about processing. Let's talk about beginners. Let's just say somebody wants to get started. What do beginners often get wrong when they approach photo scanning? What are their common mistakes?
That's a good question. A lot. No.
Why is it that you said like the first time you go out to scan something, you discover you can't use it? Let's start there. Why can't you? Why is your first scan always like not usable?
Yeah, it depends on how prepared you are, right? We live in a time now, like in the last year and a half, the amount of training material that's come out on photogrammetry is amazing. Like Gleb's got his photogrammetry course, and Ponisher's got his photogrammetry videos. William Fauché, like there's great stuff. And if you watch their content before you go out, you're gonna be successful, right? But if you're the kind of person who's like, I've watched this video about photogrammetry, and you take a bunch of pictures and align it, and you go out and just try and do that, it's not going to go super well. And mostly it comes down to the way that you shoot something, the pattern that you shoot it in, and the amount of coverage that you have on your photos. Coverage being overlap, right? So if I take a photo over here and then take a photo over here, there's no overlap at all. But if I take a photo here and then here, there's a lot of overlap between those two photos, which is really valuable. And for the people who are only on audio, I'm sorry, but there's...
What amount of overlap do you recommend?
I say 50 to 80%.
50%. Oh, wow.
If
like
you're
80% overlap?
Yeah.
So you're moving like a smidge to take the next photo.
Yeah, especially if you're a beginner,
wow.
because beginners have the tendency to just not take enough photos, like ever. That's the biggest mistake, is probably just not taking enough photos, and they're moving too much between their photos, which means there's just not enough overlap. Like a beginner might take 0 to 15% overlap, right? If you're a pro, and you've been doing it long enough, and you're really mindful of how you're taking your photos, like 30 to 50% is going to do well, right?
So if you know what you're doing, you can cut that number down. Okay.
For sure. But I recommend shooting for 50 to 80 because you're going to get a better result overall if you do it that way, right? Okay. But you can get away with 30 to 50% without any issues, and that's far more efficient than 80% overlap, because if you're doing 80% overlap, like, you're basically scanning the thing twice, right?
Right,
so it is a lot of overlap, but really, especially with modern tools, like, it's hard to get something really wrong with photogrammetry for your first attempt and as a beginner. So I always say, like, if you want to set yourself up for success, it's going to be having a decent gear. You don't have to go out and spend, $5,000 on the latest flagship camera, but maybe don't use your phone. A lot of people say, like, yeah, you can get into it just with your phone, and you can, but nobody wants to use that asset, right?
Okay,
it's not very good. So I would say, like, even if you can, like I said, when I started with Rock Essentials, I used my mom's crappy little terrible camera, right? Use whatever you can. If it's not a phone, it's probably going to do pretty well. Because one of the things about phones is that their images are very heavily processed, even when you're shooting in RAW, right? Even if you're in the RAW format, they're processed, and they have embedded profiles within that image that make them look a certain way. And all cameras do, but
and
if
also
you
the
use
quality when you get up close, it's got that squiggly pattern.
It's like
I don't know what it is.
Watercolor.
It looks like watercolors. I'm like, why did they convert it into a watercolor? Anyway,
the closest, and it pains me to say it because I'm not an Apple guy. I don't like Apple, but iPhones are the closest you can get, right? If you can get a good iPhone, like the latest iPhone, their cameras are quite well. So if you're going to scan with a phone,
even that, the best iPhone is going to be way worse than the worst mirrorless.
Yeah, if you take the money that you would have spent on that ridiculously overpriced phone and put it towards a halfway okay camera, it's going to be far better for you, right? Yeah, so get a better camera and just start there, right? Obviously, there's lots of conversations about how 50 to 80% overlap and all that kind of stuff. We can go on and on about beginner mistakes, but bottom line is photogrammetry software, especially Agisoft, is really forgiving. Like, you don't have to be super specific about the way that you shoot your photos. As long as you've taken a picture of every square centimeter of your subject, you're probably going to be okay, right? And it's going to look good, and it's going to be a successful scan. But in terms of setting yourself off right, having halfway okay gear is going to help a lot. And doing things like cross-polarizing, all that kind of stuff, it's really valuable. What I see far too often, though, is when people scan, because this is kind of the way everybody teaches scanning, is a pattern. When I say pattern, it's like the order that you shoot photos in, right? Or the pattern that you shoot your photos in. So if you're thinking about a ground scan, right, and you want to scan a square section of ground, you could move around in a circle and take radial photos spiraling in until you get to the center, and that works, but I don't recommend it because it doesn't really fit what you're scanning, right? If you're scanning a square patch of ground, scan a grid. Scan a line across the top, then move down a little bit, and then scan back across. So you kind of scan in this zigzagging, snaking pattern, like the old game Snake, right? Imagine you're just doing that and bloop, 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 eating all these little things as you're going down and across. That makes sense, right? Flat subjects are easy to scan, but when you get into 3D objects, 9 times out of 10, when somebody's teaching it, and I see it in absolutely every beginner photogrammetry tutorial, they say, move in a circle around your subject taking pictures. It's like, okay, why? In what way does a circle match, a large rock? It doesn't, right? Or you'll shoot in a dome shape, right? Like, do circles around your subject and do it at varying angles.
That's what I thought. Okay, so you're not doing that. Why not?
Well, think about it. Like, what does a circle match, or a cylinder, or a spherical pattern of shooting? It matches cylindrical subjects and spherical subjects, right?
Right. Like a bowl would be great. Circle.
Perfect. Yeah, exactly.
But a rock, I see what you mean.
So what
you're just going to be missing detail because there's going to be cavities in there or points or something.
Sure.
And you just won't get the detail in those areas.
Potentially, right? And moving in a circle, the reason people teach this is because it gives you great coverage. And you can most of the time capture everything, right? Unless there's weird little crevices that you have to get at a weird angle to scan. But even as a beginner, you're going to be kind of mindful of that. It's like, is that in my, I don't think that's in my ring of photos, so let me just move a little bit out, right? Most beginners are going to be able to go, okay, let me break the mold a little bit here. But what I like to teach is I call planar scanning. If you try and think about it as like sculpting a face, a lot of people like to talk about the planes of a face, right? Don't think about all the details and the volumes. Think about the planes, like the primary flat planes of a portrait sculpt. Try and
do the same with a rock.
Try and look at your subject and address planes, right? Even if it's kind of rounded and bulbous, you can find areas that are generally the same face, right? Facing out in the same direction. You could average it into a plane here, right? Scan across that. So if I have a rock that has a big sharp face that's going up here and then it comes down, I'm going to scan directly on that one sharp face and then scan planar directly on the other sharp face. The reason I like to do this is because if you're moving in a circle around something that's not circular shaped, you are sacrificing not your geometry. Your geometry is probably going to be fine, but you're sacrificing your texture. One of the things we battle all the time with scanning is focus, right? If you are focusing on something flat, like a ground, everything's flat, it's on the same depth. Easy to keep in focus. But if you're at a glancing angle of your ground, looking at, focusing in the middle, the background of your ground is out of focus, and the foreground is out of focus. So you start to get these blurry textures. So the idea of scanning planar and just trying to establish, okay, this area is generally facing and flat, within reason. I'm going to scan across this planar area because that'll keep it as flat towards my camera as possible. Whereas if I move a circle, right, in a circle around a flat subject, now I'm at weird angles that are bringing in focus into play. And that results in blurry patches in your texture.
You're going to have one part of it which is in focus, and then the rest is going to be... Right, I didn't even think of that. That's
like imagine, here's a fantastic example. Imagine a baguette, right? A long piece of bread, and you've just got it sitting flat on a table and you move around it. When you're focusing on the end of that baguette, the other side of it doesn't exist. It's just a big blur, right? Useless, right? But if you were to instead flip it so that it's standing up straight and move in a circle that way, so that
would be great. Yeah,
now you're looking at it at more of a planar approach. You're still moving in a circle around it, but that's how you do it.
Yeah.
So like something like a box, right? If you wanted to scan this old antique crate or something, you don't want to move in a circle around it. Establish the faces. There's 6 faces to a box, so you're going to have 6 planes to look at, and you're going to scan fairly flat on those 6 planes, right? And then you're going to have, I would call like in-between coverage, right? Between those planes, you're going to have some angled photos just to connect those planes together. Because if you just go from plane to plane, it doesn't have a lot to relate them together. So you'll scan all your planes and scan in between slight angled shots just to transition over, right? Okay. But if you're moving just in a full circle all around, you're missing a lot, right? You're missing a lot and sacrificing a lot of texture quality there. So it's something I see is like in every beginner tutorial, it's like move in a circle around your subject taking photos. And it works. Like it does. It gives you data, but when you start to get in and dig through it, it's like, why is my texture super blurry? Like this one spot is super sharp and this spot just like has an obvious blurry patch. It's because it was out of focus. And the best way to solve that is to scan to your subject, right? So when you're scanning, like if you scan in circles, typically what you do is you do a ring and then you'll raise your camera up and point it down and you'll do another ring. And so you're kind of creating a sphere, right? Kind of a sphere of photos around your subject. So imagine in Blender or in whatever, right? You have a sphere and you scatter points across that sphere. You can imagine every single one of those points being a camera, right? One of your photos is on that sphere. And if you have a subject in the middle that's not spherical, it doesn't make sense.
They're different distances,
right?
Yeah.
But if you then take that subject,
it makes a lot of sense.
If you take that subject and instead scatter the points along that subject and then just scale them out along an angle.
Yes.
Now you have them, it matches, right? So
Right.
planar
That makes a
scanning,
lot of
obviously,
sense.
it's hard to think about because, like, well, this rock isn't just a bunch of flat planes, right? You get as close as you
It's
can.
averaging it
right?
out. Yeah.
Averaging it
Yeah.
out, right? So
Huh.
that's what I would say is, like,
Very
beginners,
good.
stop scanning in circles. It's not helping you.
That's great. That's beautiful. Okay. Let's talk about myths and misconceptions. What are some common myths or misconceptions about photo scanning? I'll start with one, by the way, just
Sure.
on this conversation. It's not magic and it's not easy.
Yeah.
And it's certainly not automatic.
For sure. That's the
People
biggest.
think you just snap a few photos and you're done. It's like,
Yeah.
damn, if only.
Yeah, for sure. Right. That's the biggest one. And like early on, even still, like to this day, there's some people that are just keyboard warriors who are like, yeah, you're not a real artist because all you did was take a bunch of photos, right? It's like, okay,
Yeah.
you try it, right? Let's see how you do,
yeah.
right? It's just a different application. Like it's a very technical approach to the art as opposed to
Yeah.
sculpting it by hand, right?
Yeah.
But taking like photography and cinematography is not, not art, right? Compared to painting a frame. Photography is still art, right? So photogrammetry is definitely still a form of art, and it's definitely not cheating when it achieves superior quality in a lot of scenarios, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's not to say that it's made hand modelers and sculptors obsolete, because as far as I'm aware, I can't scan a spaceship, right? So if I'm working on Star Wars, probably have to hand model that, right? There's a lot of things like that, or things that you just can't justify scanning. But yeah, that's a big one. Is like people think it's easy, and so because it's easy, it's like cheating. You've gotten from point A to point B faster than somebody who hand modeled it. It's like, well, technically, yes, I did, right? Like to do a full body scan of a character is way faster than sculpting a character from scratch, right?
Indeed. Yeah.
But it's a different medium, right? It's a different application. But yeah, that is a common thing. Is that people think it's easy and super approachable, and it is, right? It is super approachable. It's just you have to realize that there's two different worlds to photogrammetry. There's the hobbyist who's like, yeah, I can scan something and I just want to make something for my scene in Blender and I want it to look really cool, and I love those people, and the scanning that they're doing is awesome because it fits the need, and that's all you want. But when you get into a pipeline or to a production, there's a lot of things at play, right, that you need to consider. And probably the biggest one is consistency, right? Photogrammetry artists like to talk about, or any artist likes to talk about the uncanny valley, right? Oh, if this character looks even slightly off, it looks weird, it feels unnatural. But it's not just with characters, it's with everything, right? And scanning is the same. If your scan library isn't consistent or cohesive, it doesn't look right. Right, and this is something a lot of scanners don't quite understand, is not just from a location standpoint of like, I shouldn't put a desert rock with a mossy rock in my forest scene. Right? Obviously, that's not right, right? But even more granular than that is color calibration, exposure calibration, all this kind of stuff. Like, if you had completely different exposure values for one scan than another, that color data is completely different. Or if you did one scan cross-polarized and the other linear polarized or unpolarized, those are completely different, right?
Right, because
So
it's going to be darker or lighter because it didn't have the film.
Yeah. So it's very
true.
Cohesion is a big part of it, and that's one of the things that plays into, like, scanning isn't necessarily easy. You deal with all the same problems that you do with any other form of production for production, right? You deal with these things like the uncanny valley. You deal with things like realism, even still. Like, you're scanning something, but the difference between a beginner scanning something and a senior scanning something, that senior's result is much more real, much more tangible, much more believable than the beginner, because they've taken everything into account, whether it's scanning planar instead of scanning circular, so you have cleaner textures, or you're doing cross-polarizing, or you're using a ring light, or you're calibrating your colors correctly. There's a lot that goes into it. And that's just from a data acquisition standpoint. Like, it goes deep, right? As you move down the chain, because we talk about photogrammetry, and like we kind of mentioned it in that, why don't we just use Poliigon for reducing our scans.
Yeah.
It's because it's a completely different beast. Photogrammetry isn't hand models. So everything that you do in processing photogrammetry is different. You wouldn't ask a fluid simulator to rig a character, right? Oh, why didn't you do your fluid sim with, whatever rigging tool? Why didn't you do your fluid sim with motion capture, right? It's like, okay, you can't really do that, right?
That's right. I think it probably, like, the misconceptions also probably come from, like, seemingly almost every tutorial I've seen on photogrammetry is very uninspiring. Like, I always come there like, all right, I'm going to learn some, like, photogrammetry stuff, and it's like, okay, download this app. I'm like, what? Already off to a bad start.
Yeah.
Like, so we're doing it with a phone,
Yeah.
and it's just like they're like pa 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 around the the log, and then they just hit a button, and then they bring it into Blender, and I go like, I think you left some steps behind. I'm guessing.
Yeah.
So people just kind of assume that that's all it is, and that little stump that was scanned in that 2-minute tutorial is the same as a scan that was done for a game or a library like Poliigon, and they could not be further apart. Like one,
For sure.
you said, could take 10 days versus 2 minutes.
Yeah, no doubt.
So yeah, very different.
It is, yeah, and that's kind of the thing with photogrammetry. Even if you have somebody who's super experienced training you in photogrammetry, like I said, photogrammetry is very technical. A lot of the time, the people that get into really technical roles like that don't have the best teaching abilities, right?
Yeah,
or don't have
true.
the most, excitable, inspiring, like high energy, something that's engaging for people, right?
Yes.
So that can be a big thing as well. And hey,
Yeah.
that's a big part of the industry as a whole, not just photogrammetry, but everything is like work through the yawns that you might experience when watching this kind of content or reading. Like photogrammetry is like, you can watch stuff and that can get you a certain degree. Like I said, like people like Clint and William Fauché, like they've got good videos for beginners, right, to get started.
William Fauché. So yeah, that was another question I was going to say. Like, are there any good YouTube tutorials out there that people should watch?
Yeah,
William Fauché.
William Fauché. People, there's probably a lot of people that already know him. Fantastic Unreal artist, really great.
Yeah, I've seen his stuff. Yep.
Clinton Jones, people know him from Corridor. He's doing his own stuff now as the Punisher on YouTube. And he's got
PWNISHER. So he's got photogrammetry tutorials.
Yep, he's got one or two in there. I think he did one about scanning as one wheel, which is a great exercise in scanning all sides of a subject, right, in a studio setting. So really great approach there. And he also has one on scanning large surfaces, like cliff face. So that was really interesting.
A drone. Oh,
yep.
Wow.
Then William Fauché has, I think, for me, probably the most engaging and like inspiring stuff. He's got great fundamental videos on like beginner stuff. How do you approach scanning? He does teach a circular method, but he teaches it on a log, which makes sense because it's cylindrical, right? So it's a great approach. He also has a video. He traveled to, I think there's a place in Norway. But it was just a fun experience, like a really good, engaging setting for learning how photogrammetry works, and a very practical approach to it. Like, it's very nitty gritty, just getting the data that you need for the project that you're working on. And I love that kind of thing.
This was William Fauché's one?
Yeah, William Fauché, yeah.
Okay, got it. Was there anyone else you recommended? I thought there was a third person.
Gleb Alexandrov from Creative Shrimp.
Yes.
They've got a great course on photogrammetry. And James Candy. James Candy's awesome.
That's true. Yep.
He says like some of the oldest videos on photogrammetry, and that's what a lot of like artists today, like myself, have like learned from. But they still hold up.
What's his YouTube title name? It's not Classy, James Candy. What is it?
No, Classy Dogs. Yeah, Classy Dog
Dogs,
Films.
That's right.
Yeah, he's got two
Dog
channels.
Films.
He's got Classy Dog Films, and then there's another one, Classy Dog
Pictures.
Can't remember.
With 81 subscribers. I don't know if that's the same one. But anyway. Okay.
But yeah, Classy Dog.
Yes, I've seen his is the only one where I could recall, like, that's actually a decent tutorial.
Yeah.
But,
he's
I
a
haven't
funny
seen
guy,
Punishes
too.
Yeah, he is.
Great guy.
It's good. Yeah.
It's the comedy's for a certain kind of person, like in those videos, but I laugh my ass off watching those tracks and swear. Like, it's funny stuff. Yeah. So,
exactly.
Great videos. Yeah, there's a excellent places to start. There's been
Yeah.
a number of talks from various studios at GDC or Gnomon events. Like, take it in, right? Take it all in.
Yeah.
Google it, search it, YouTube it, find it, and absorb it.
Yeah, nice.
And then read the papers too. Like, it's one thing to, like, obviously I think, especially in my generation, most of us are visual learners, and we like to watch videos, we like to watch YouTube. We want somebody to, like, show us and explain it to us. But at the end of the day, a lot of this technology that's developed and a lot of the techniques that are produced are only in written format and only in papers. So read those
Sure.
too. It's definitely, that's going to be the quickest way to advance your understanding and your experience there.
Awesome. And the only other thing, actually, I just realized now at the very end, I didn't ask the question on software. What's the best software for photo scanning?
There is none. There's no best software. Yeah, the two big dogs are Reality Capture and Agisoft. If you're willing to spend money, that's what you're going with, right?
Agisoft?
Yeah, Agisoft Metashape is what it's called.
Okay, so that's the expensive one.
No. Well, it depends. So
Okay.
there's two, Reality Capture and Agisoft Metashape. Those are both paid, and we'll break those down. But those, if you're a professional and you're wanting to produce high quality scans, that's what you're going with. But another one is, was it Mesh Room, Mesh Lab? I think it's Mesh Room.
Oh, the free one.
Yeah. Yeah, from Alice Vision, Mesh Room is a free photogrammetry tool that is awesome. It's great. If you want to start learning photogrammetry and you want to do it for free, get into Mesh Room and play around with that. It's node-based too. They've got nodes in there, so if you like playing with nodes, it's really fun.
Nice.
And it's free. Obviously, because it's free, not that this is always the case, but because it's free, the development is not as fast or as pinpoint as Agisoft or Reality Capture. I think it will be, but Meshroom's not been around for as long. Reality Capture and Agisoft has been around for a long time, so what they do is definitely better. And then it kind of comes down to what your needs are. I would say that if you're an individual just doing scans for yourself, go with Metashape. Metashape does two things really well. One, you can buy a standard license for, like, I think maybe $200, and that's a lifetime license that you have forever, and you get updates forever, right?
You get updates forever?
Yeah.
What is their business model?
I don't know, right?
That's insane. Wait, so we've only bought one license from them before, and we just get all the updates for free? That's
well, yeah,
$200.
for each seat, right? For each seat that we have.
Sure.
So a license is only for one person, right? But yeah, we have updates.
But damn,
for
that's
all of it.
crazy. How do they pay for the development of the tool? That's anyways. I'm sure people listening are like, "No, Andrew, it's a good thing." Like, yeah, not if it doesn't update fast enough.
Yeah,
because they haven't got developers.
I tell you what, though, that is one of the downsides of Agisoft is it's not as up to date with the latest technologies. It does a really good job, but the other thing is Agisoft is far more geared towards what do you call it? It's geared towards, like, survey, so like drone data, lidar data, that kind of stuff. It's great for survey, but it's awesome for, like, standard photogrammetry like we do. The other thing that's great about it, aside from price, is that it is the most forgiving tool I've ever used as far as shooting patterns are concerned. You can basically just take photos at random of your subject, and as long as there's coverage in there, it'll piece it together. Whereas there's other softwares that if you just took random photos, like take a photo on this side, go to the other side of the subject, take a photo there, and, like, just do it completely random, they're not going to be able to figure it out. But Agisoft is really good at doing that. It's phenomenal at just finding the correct matches. And so if you're a beginner, it's a great tool to start off with, because if you haven't honed in your shooting pattern techniques for capturing, you're probably still going to be fine, right? So that's great about it. It is slow, though. It's not as fast as Reality Capture, so it's going to take a little bit longer to process your sets than Reality Capture would. But in my experience, the output from Reality Capture is often more detailed than, the output from Metashape is often more detailed than Reality Capture. When you get to a very fine level, Metashape's meshing and the detail that you can get out of it is better. It's definitely sharper, it's cleaner, there's higher frequency detail in your geometry than what you get from Reality Capture. But Reality Capture is going to get you like 90% of that detail for like an eighth of the time. Like it can go a lot faster. So nowadays, now that Reality Capture has improved its quality, I say probably go for Reality Capture if you have the money. because reality capture, in my opinion, is really stupid, and that they use what's called
they switched to like
input.
credit-based system.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you pay like a credit for every megapixel of photo that you're putting through your tool, right? So depending on how you scan, if you're a beginner and you've taken 100 photos for your subject, it's probably only going to cost you a couple bucks, right? But if you're going for a high fidelity, high detailed, clean texture asset, you're looking at maybe $30, $40 to process one asset, right?
What?
The cool thing about it, though, is you can take all these
Forget
photos,
that.
process everything, and you don't have to pay until you want to export it. So it's completely free if you just want to scan
So
and
if you
see
do
how
a
that goes.
botch scan, it won't charge you.
Exactly.
Oh, that's good. Okay,
you
so I was
only
going to
pay
say
when you
that's
export
expensive to learn. Yeah.
No, yeah. And
Yeah,
once
yeah.
you've paid for it, it IDs like all of your photos, and it knows that you've already paid for all of these photos. So anytime you use these photos again, you can export without having to pay again. The only time you have
okay.
to pay is if you change your data set and add photos to it, right?
I
So
see.
it
Okay.
definitely, it's a great tool. It's really fast. The alignment, like the mesh building, isn't as detailed, but something that I found is it resolves holes a lot more than Agisoft does. Sometimes when you're scanning, if you didn't get enough coverage in a certain area, when you're building high fidelity meshes, there's not enough information there. It just says, okay, we're just going to put a hole there, right? We don't know what was there, so let's not assume what was there. And that's what Metashape does. But reality capture, it's like, you probably don't want a hole here, so we're going to assume what was here. It just might not be accurate. And that's actually really handy
That
for
is pretty useful.
artists that aren't going for like, industrial measurements off of our scans.
Right.
We just, I don't want to have to fill a hole and then have to like, it just does it for you, right? So it looks a lot cleaner, but it's not as high fidelity. So it's a balance, right? There's no, okay, what's better? Is it reality capture or is it Metashape? I say if you're a beginner, go Metashape. But if you are a professional that wants to, be more approachable for the industry, try reality capture. With that being said, I'm counterintuitive here, or contradicting myself, because I have everybody at Poliigon using Metashape. It's what we use, right? But yeah, there's reasons for that. Because we work with like high-end ArcViz stuff, that fidelity that I talk about with Metashape is really important to us. But there could be a world where, as we might want to expand into different things, maybe we want to use reality capture because it's better for that subject. So it depends, right? If you're an environment artist and you want to have like the industry standard skill set and tool set, use reality capture and learn that through and through. You're probably just going to spend a lot more money on it by paying per photo, right? But
right, I see.
if you are a ArcViz artist or somebody who needs really high fidelity, high accuracy in your measurements, anything that's sharp, detailed to like a crazy degree, go Metashape. It's a bit slower. Got it. But it's getting faster every update, and at the end of the day,
Metashape, they got standard edition and like professional edition. So it goes from like $180 for standard to $3,500 for professional.
Yeah.
Do you need professional?
No. The professional comes with a lot of things that are more towards the surveying and LiDAR side of reconstruction.
Okay. Yeah.
For an artist, it has two things that are really, like, you might want to consider it. Thing number one is it allows you to use custom markers. So if you're having troubles aligning, let's say, the two halves of a scan, like you have a rock, you've scanned one side, then you flip it over and you scan the other side, sometimes it has a hard time aligning those two together. So if you can add in custom markers to say this point aligns with this point aligns with this point, you can add in these custom anchors so that it'll have a better time aligning them. Custom markers, right? It can be really handy with more complex scans. And then the other side of it too is that it allows you to use scale bars. Scale bars, there's a handful of different types of them, but essentially it's a ground truth that you can put in your data set that you know the accurate measurement of. So when you scan it, you can say, here's my scale bar, this is what it is. Then the tool will know, okay, this is what size we are. Because if you just scan something without a scale bar, you could scan a peanut and it might think it's a kilometer long, right? It has no idea what you're scanning. So using a scale bar gives you some reference for that. And it can also automate a lot of things like your pivots and stuff like that. So scale bars are cool. only professional edition. Reality Capture has all that.
You can also get by with just chucking a ruler in the shot.
Yep. Yeah, or just not doing it, right? Like a lot of our licenses at Poliigon are standard, and all we do is like, hey, measure your subject when you're scanning it, and then tell us what that measurement is, so that we can scale it properly at the end of the pipeline, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, makes sense.
But it takes an amount of automation out of it, right? So if you want something really fast, automated, and efficient, in that, like, you can really improve the way that you digest data, like photos, in that you just drop it into a folder and then it does everything, processes it, and puts it through your pipeline, and then you look at it at the end and go, does this look right? And if it does, then perfect.
Right.
If it doesn't, then you go back and try and tweak it. But things like that, having support for things like scale bars, it can go a long way for helping automate your pipeline.
Got it. Makes sense. Cool. Well, that was amazing, man. I'm sure the people got a lot out of that. People who are keen to start photo scanning. Where can people find you if they wanted to follow your scans?
Yeah, I'm not much of an uploader. I have scans here and there that I'm like, yeah, this was cool. Let's put it up. But ArtStation, I'm on ArtStation. You can find me there. Mason Menzies, Instagram, Mason Menzies Art. People always try and follow my personal account. I won't let that happen, so stop asking. I only accept.
Wait, you've got a personal account where?
On Instagram. No, on Instagram.
Oh, on Instagram.
It's set to private, so people are like, request to follow. I'm like, if I don't know you, you're not getting in. So go to the art channel, Mason Menzies Art.
Yes.
And that's that's where you can find me. I hope people like get into photogrammetry because it's an addiction and it's a really healthy one. It gets you outside, it gets you moving, it gets you going, and it's so much fun. Yeah.
That's awesome. Great. Well, thanks, man. That was awesome.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me on.